Live streamed show where we talk about what's happening in economics. Today I've got Greg with me. Welcome, Greg.
Hello, welcome, Matt.
We're going to start at 2, but obviously it's 5 to 2, but this just gives people a chance to get in. So what's happened that's interesting this week, Greg?
Nothing happened in the cricket that I can think of. I don't think they had a test match. I think they cancelled it, didn't they?
Yeah, well, we were all watching the soccer.
All watching the soccer, the football.
Yeah, football.
And seems like, well, it started off well with the soccer because at halftime it started off well in the cricket because at halftime in the soccer was switched over and there was a wicket straight away for the English, and that was about as good as it got though. So
yeah.
But it was annoying that it was on a Thursday night because I truly was spending the night almost sitting back and thinking, oh, the weekend's here, Friday night, this is great. And then
so much sport, it must be Friday night.
Then it twigged, we have to come back and do some work today. So I've just spent today pretending it's a sad day and acting accordingly, really. But you know.
Fair enough. So today we're encouraging you again to ask questions in the chat. So when we get started, I'll remind you again, but please ask your economic questions. We're happy to try and answer stuff. It was another big week in economic news. We've got lots to talk about today. The Reserve Bank has a new governor, or governor-elect, or governor-elect appointed. I don't know what you call it.
Probably don't call her a governess.
Governess.
That's probably not good. Yep, new one.
The unemployment figures came out again, and they're continuing to act quite strong. We've got just today we had the government announce its new framework for wellbeing. So rather than just relying on inflation, unemployment, and growth in GDP, we've actually got some other measures that might actually make up how well or badly the economy and Australia as a whole is doing.
Yeah, hot off the press, 131 pages of wellbeing framework. Which we'll dive into and try and dissect because it's a good idea, but have they delivered on what they could have delivered on in terms of it, or is it a bit of a rehash? So we'll get into that.
Yeah, certainly a lot of measures in there.
Yep.
And we also might have a little talk about the Commonwealth Games, at least from an economic perspective. Was it a good thing to cancel? We might talk a little bit about sunk cost fallacy, which is a thing economists love and everybody falls for, including economists. But yeah, it's certainly an interesting time to see these big mega events, which I remember when I was a kid, Australia winning the 2000 Olympics was a major achievement.
Massive.
Nowadays they shop around and will somebody please take the games.
I mean, Brisbane won by default.
Yeah,
really,
yeah,
for
they
the
were the only
32
bidder.
ones, and.
But I remember when there was corruption in the IOC because they were giving, countries were paying to, get an advantage in the competition to see who would host. How things have changed.
Yeah, and I mean, I can remember the Brisbane Commonwealth Games. They were a massive thing that someone would even get a gold in the Commonwealth Games. My goodness, they could become a national hero. And now we don't even really want them.
No, are they dead? Or, I certainly think that these huge mass events are going to change, or they have to, or they are going to disappear.
Yep.
Yeah. All right. So again, don't forget to ask questions if you want to. We've got some people filing in. We'll start in less than a minute. So we're keen to know any questions you have, particularly on issues that have popped up in the last fortnight, but any economics questions you have, Greg and I are here to answer them.
And just, in general things like which will be better, Barbie or Oppenheimer. We're here to judge you for your film choices.
I haven't seen either of them.
I've got my Oppenheimer tickets all ready for tonight, so looking forward to that. Don't know about Barbie.
Yeah, maybe you're not the target audience, Greg.
Probably not. I'm far too cynical and jaded. But I do like Greta Gerwig. She's one of my favourite directors, so I probably will get around to it. But I might leave the opening weekend to the diehards, I think.
Yeah,
and I'll just reinforce my stereotype of a middle-aged bloke and go see the movie about the making of the atomic bomb.
Yeah, much more sober.
Stay in my lane.
All right, it's now 2:00, so let's begin. So thank you very much for joining us. You're watching Nation in a Nutshell. with me today, I'm Matt Grudnoff, and with me today is Greg Jericho, one of the other economists at the Australia Institute, and we're here to discuss what's happened in the last fortnight in economics. And also, we're keen to hear your questions. So if you have any questions at all, please put them in the chat, and we'll do our best to answer them. So we might start with the RBA, as we have actually for a couple of these episodes. It seems to be interest rates and the RBA are big in the news, but a week ago, we got a new governor of the RBA, which is unusual. So usually a governor, their first appointment is a 7-year term, and then they have an option on a 3-year extension. And for the last 20 years or more, they've always got the 3-year extension. But Philip, he didn't get his 3-year extension.
Phil. No. I mean, it's a weird thing in itself, just a 3-year extension. Why not? If they're good enough, reappoint them. I know.
Yeah, for another 7 years.
Oh, you're good. We'll just give you 3 years.
Or have 5 years and 5 years or something. Yeah,
exactly. It seems a weird thing to have. A 7-year appointment is a weird appointment. I guess it's got something to do with business cycles or something.
I don't know.
God knows. But
Philip
we
Lowe,
do have a new one.
Yeah, so he's made some mistakes. Let's be frank. He made a lot of mistakes, and I don't think it was a huge surprise that he didn't get his extension. I think that was probably what most people thought was going to happen. Certainly, we've criticised him here on his obsession with wages pushing inflation, when clearly that isn't what's driving inflation. But, you know, and there was a lot of criticism, particularly in the RBA review, of the RBA's insular thinking, that it couldn't think outside its very narrow scope of what it thought in particular causes inflation, but it's very narrow economic scope. And that could have been because, you know, Philip Lowe started the RBA at 17 and had spent pretty much his entire career there. So his replacement, Michelle Bullock, is she completely different? Does she come from outside, Greg?
Well, she is completely different in that she hasn't been there for 40 years, like Philip Lowe has been. Completely different, only, 38?
38 years.
Massive change. I mean, you know, there has obviously been a lot of criticism of Philip Lowe in the last year or so about interest rates, but I really think the writing was on the wall from the RBA review, which was really sort of highlighting that there needed to be a big cultural change in the RBA, become very insular. There wasn't a lot of hearing of outside ideas or new thinking. There was a real lack of flow of ideas coming from lower ranks through to the executive. And so it was that kind of thing, which was a sense of saying, hey, this has happened on your watch. You have kind of ended up with the situation where the Reserve Bank, there needed to be a review of it. And a lot of people are thinking, right, the government, for the first time since Bernie Fraser back in the early 1990s, there was the belief, and I certainly thought so, that they'd hire someone from outside.
And Philip Lowe wasn't really keen on the review, like the results of the review. Like when they were talking about, well, you know, you need to change, he was kind of, oh, well, I don't not quite agree with that. Like he was very lukewarm.
Yeah.
So I think even that would have been like, are you the governor to bring about this review and change the RBA's thinking? Probably not at all.
No, and so I guess the hope is that Michelle Bullock, the new governor, has been sitting in the deputy spot and in her time at the RBA thinking, God, we could do this a lot better. Hopefully.
Though, last month she came out and she sort of belled the cat. Like economists understand that actually, as the RBAs have been increasing interest rates recently, they're actually targeting a higher unemployment rate. That is, and people find this shocking, but it's absolutely true. The RBA currently thinks that the unemployment rate should be, at a minimum, 4.5%, and it's currently 3.5%. So they want an extra about 150,000 unemployed people. And the reason is because they're obsessed with wages driving inflation, and if you have more unemployed people, then those that do have jobs are more worried about losing it and aren't going to demand higher wages. Yeah,
and Michelle Bullock last month gave a speech, and it was seen by some as her basic audition, I guess, or final audition for the top job, which was on full employment. And she basically said that while they don't believe in this sort of thing strictly of the non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment, they really kind of did. And so for them, 4.5% is notionally full employment, which, as Matt says, we're looking at 140 to 150,000 extra people unemployed, and that'll mostly come from losing jobs as opposed to people coming from school and coming from outside the labour force and becoming unemployed. Most of it will come from people losing jobs. But
yeah, it's not likely
you
to
know,
be the economists in the RBA
No.
are going to be the ones losing their job. They're just going to be the ones that think
Yeah.
that other people should lose their job.
Yeah.
But speaking of unemployment, the figures came out earlier this week. And again, we've seen a surprisingly strong labour market. It was at 3.5%, which is 0.1% down. But let's be honest, monthly figures move around a little bit. And what's been happening over the last 12 months is it's basically been between about 3.5 and 3.7. So we know
Yep.
that given that, that there's a margin of error there, the unemployment rate is about 3.6% at the moment.
Yeah, the trend level, which is a bit more stable, that's been at 3.5% for a year, basically. I think 11 months.
But we've had all these interest rate rises,
it's
right?
incredible. It really is. And because I must admit, I've been expecting the unemployment rate to go up because that's what the Reserve Bank has been wanting to happen. You can say they're targeting inflation, but it almost seems like they're really targeting unemployment, and they've been raising interest rate 400 basis points or 4 percentage points up since April last year, all designed to slow the economy, to raise unemployment so there's less money racing around. People are less likely to ask for higher wages because they're worried about losing their job. And they've done the interest rate aspect, and yet the labour market has just kept powering on, kept doing well, 3.5%. Now, you can always sort of argue the toss and say, oh, well, underemployment has kind of risen a bit. And certainly underutilisation might be a better way of looking at the whole strength of
So underutilisation includes people who have a job but want more hours.
Yeah, want more hours. Generally, people working casual or part-time who would like either to go full-time or at least get another shift. But even when you're looking at those measures, we're doing a lot better now than we were before the pandemic. The labour market is very strong, and it is something that certainly we should actually be celebrating, and not just celebrating, but hoping and working to keep. This belief that we got to get to 4.5% unemployment just so we can get inflation down is really backwards in essentially our view. We kind of think we've got a once in a generation time, because all of our working life, unemployment below 4% is like, well, that happened back in the 60s when
that was my parents' generation.
Yeah, when hardly any women worked, and so the actual people looking for work, well, when you cut out half the population, it's easy to keep the unemployment down. But the fact we're there now, it's like we should be doing everything we can to keep it low, rather than saying, oh, well, this isn't the real important measure at the moment. The important measure is inflation, so we can sacrifice this 50-year record low unemployment just so we can get inflation back down to this random, well, not random, but arbitrary 3% rate, as though that's somehow set in gold.
Yeah, and look, while the labour market has been really strong, we have seen kind of weakness in the rest of the economy. For example, retail spending we've seen has fallen. But again, as we talked about a few weeks ago, it's actually, there's a real split in retail spending. So in real terms, retail spending for people over 55 continues to go up. Retail spending for people under 55 continue to go down. And obviously that's a sign of this increasing housing costs, increase in mortgages, increases in rents.
Yep.
That's impacting younger people. People over 55 have probably paid their house off. They own it outright. They're not affected by rising rents because they don't rent. Some over 55s absolutely rent. But I'm talking as a group on average. They don't rent, and they've probably paid their mortgage off, so they're not impacted by interest rates. And more data came out this week that looked at deposits by age. So over the pandemic, people were all locked up. They couldn't spend money. So what we found is people build up savings buffers. We saw in the national accounts, there were hundreds of billions of dollars built up in household savings because they couldn't spend it. And the RBA was saying, well, we have to increase interest rates faster because there are these big buffers of savings that we need to eat through before people will change their spending habits. But the data that we got today was really fascinating. It showed, again, not particularly surprising, but great data, that the savings weren't evenly spread when we looked at them by age. Who was actually saving?
Older people without a mortgage. funnily enough, they're doing quite well despite interest rates skyrocketing. And equally shocking, those people who are more likely to have a mortgage are really doing it tough. Like, there are no savings buffers anymore. If you're renting, you'll know that your rents have been going up. We know that rents are expected to keep going up and flow through into the inflation figures over the next sort of 12 months even. But if you're definitely paying off a mortgage, your interest payments have increased massively. So I think about 75-80% in the past year.
Yeah, I mean, 35 to 44-year-olds have dis savings. That
Yeah.
is, they're going backwards. They have less than zero savings at the
Yep.
moment. They're in net debt. And everybody below that basically has almost zero
Yeah.
savings. But if you get into the 65 age bracket, they have by far most of the savings. In fact, they almost have half of all savings is held by people over 65.
And also actually for people in retirement age, often they will have money invested in term deposits and in savings like that, because that's actually part of their income, is getting the interest on their deposits. Whereas younger people, they don't bother with term deposits because they're paying off loans, or they just don't have enough money sitting around to do that. And so, again, with the rising interest rates, that's actually helped out those people while hurting the people who are having to pay their mortgage. So it's this sort of double whammy
Yeah,
at the same time.
more and more we're seeing data that's showing the real divide by age into the young people who are really hurting and are really suffering, and older people, particularly up towards retirement age and beyond, who are actually doing quite well. In fact, apart from some rising food prices, people who have paid off their house and are close to or at retirement have probably not noticed much of an impact on budgets at all. And again, like there are some retired people who rent, there are some older people who are paying off a mortgage. They will totally be suffering. But as a group, most of them haven't, and that those that don't, those that have a paid off house, are probably feeling pretty comfortable right now.
Yeah, and also even those who are paying off mortgages who are in the older bracket, and I can even sort of include myself in that, although I'm not quite over 60 yet. Getting there. The mortgages they hold are much smaller on average than the mortgages held by people if they're fortunate enough to own a house in their 30s and early 40s, because the value of the housing prices have gone up so much over the past 20 years. If you took out a loan 20 years ago, you're getting close to having it paid off. But the
And
size,
a few little interest rate rises is not going to
it's
be
not
much.
going to hurt you. But if you took out a loan, let's say in about 2015, 2016, not only had the house prices massively increased over that 15 years or so, you were taking out a loan when interest rates were pretty much at their low, and now you're really suffering from the increase in interest rates. Whereas if you took out a loan back in, say, 2007, interest rates are actually higher than they are now.
Yeah.
So you're not suffering so much.
And there's a lot of talk. I mean, there's a big problem with that. So we're basically attempting to manage the macroeconomy, stabilize the macroeconomy, using just a small group of people. People with large mortgages, they're the ones that are getting smashed in an attempt to stabilize the economy. And also by trying to increase the unemployment rate. Again, we're using a small group, the unemployed, and we're smashing them in order to stabilize the economy.
And we also know that whenever the economy slows by any sort of measure, the first people to get unemployed are not older people, they're younger people.
Yep.
The younger people, the ones who have basically were the last in, they're the first out. They're more likely to have fewer skills than people in their 40s and 50s. They are more replaceable, so they're the first ones you can lay off. And so we've got this wonderful, horrible situation where we've got interest rates rising in order to slow an economy purely because we want to get inflation down. That is hurting people in their 30s and 40s who have got their huge mortgages. And they're also the ones who are more likely, the 20s and 30-year-olds, who are more likely also going to be the ones who are going to lose their jobs. And they're the ones who are renting and hoping to one day own a home or have just started paying off a mortgage. they're in a bad state because they're really the targets at the moment.
And we don't have to do this. We don't have to smash really hard a small group. We could spread the pain. If there has to be pain, if we have to slow the economy down, you could spread it a lot more evenly. You could have a levy on income tax that you increase and decrease. All right, so, rather than just people with big mortgages having to take the big hit, you could take the total amount of demand that you want out of the economy with everybody who pays income tax. And therefore, if you've got more people, then you have to hit everybody far less than if you've only got to hit a small group of people.
Yeah. Or you could, for example, try and hit companies who are doing very nicely out of rising prices.
Yeah, if we talk about what's actually causing inflation, it's not wages.
We could, we have seen attempts to put some price caps on things like energy price and that. And of course, that always gets cried as being socialism or something. But oddly, we don't hear those same cries when governments put caps on wages. Yeah, that's apparently okay because that'll keep it. That's not socialism. But as soon as you try and limit the amount that companies can take advantage of their market power by limiting price rises, especially in essential items like energy, suddenly that's seen as, oh, that's terrible. We're like Albania or something like that in the 1980s. Whereas really, it's a much more sensible way of what in reality is still an inflation problem that is kind of due to a lot of ructions and one-off events that are flowing through. We're coming off the pandemic because of the invasion of Ukraine, which is still having impacts because we know that Russia has started targeting wheat and sunflower, which deals also with sunflower oil, which will feed into world prices of wheat and food
energy
prices and energy.
Have gone up.
Yeah. And it's a case of the Reserve Bank can raise all its interest rates at once. That's not going to change the production of wheat in Ukraine.
No, if you put interest rates up in Australia, it will not affect the world price of oil. The world price of gas will not be impacted if we put up interest rates. No, OPEC is not going to arrange an emergency meeting. Australia's put their interest rates up by 0.5%.
But Santos will be very happy because the prices of gas will be going up and it can do what it likes. Unless the government was, one, to maybe say, hey, we're going to tax your windfall profits.
Yep.
Use those to help people who are suffering and also maybe make you question whether you need to make all those windfall profits because we've got to tax them well. Or we can, as I say, put caps on. There's so many more things. And I think if the government, Reserve Bank, instead of what I think they're worrying too much about inflation and not realising the amazing opportunity we have at the moment.
And this kind of supply side inflation, the actual textbook economics way of dealing with it is to just let it wash through because inflation will go up and then the bottlenecks will resolve themselves and inflation will come down. Yeah. And that's what we've seen not only in Australia but across the world, in the US, in the UK, in Europe, in Canada, in New Zealand. All of the inflation rates are coming down as these kind of bottlenecks and supply side issues resolve themselves. And that's not due to interest rates, that's due to the inflation passing through the system. Yeah. And so we're sort of punishing people for no good reason.
Yeah, supply side inflation is more about how can we help people during this period of inflation that has nothing to do with needing to cool down the economy. Yeah. And instead, we're basically pretending that it's the 1970s or the mining boom and there's so much demand and everything in the economy, we've got to slow it down. And it's like,
it's not happening. It's not. Well, let's move on a bit. Let's move on to the Commonwealth Games. Commonwealth Games. So, back in the day,
RIP.
We used to compete, really hard for these kind of Commonwealths and Olympics and these big titles. There was a big queue of countries that desperately wanted it. I remember, the huge controversies with the International Olympic Committee where I think it was Salt Lake City was bribing those that were deciding in order to try and get the games. How things have changed.
Yes, and World Cups as well.
So Victoria got the Commonwealth Games. They got it quite late, and the reason they got it quite late, Greg, was because...
Well, the other country that was going to do it couldn't do it, and no one else wanted to do it.
So nobody else wanted it. And then they've said, well, there's been cost blowouts.
Actually, we don't even want it. Yeah.
And you can understand cost blowouts. I mean, constructing anything in Australia at the moment is really expensive.
Yeah.
And so suddenly Dan Andrews pulled the plug and said, no, it's too expensive. I don't want to spend $7-8 billion on the Commonwealth Games. Somebody worked that out. That's about $500 million a day for a 12-day event. Apparently that's too exy. Was Daniel Andrews, did he do the right thing pulling the plug?
Well, I'm sure if he'd really wanted to, he could have commissioned a consultancy firm to come up with a report saying that no, the state will actually be better off.
Like PwC.
Like PwC.
If you pay them $100,000, I'm sure they could produce you a report
Ernst
that said
and
that.
Young, I'm sure there's someone decrying the fact that there was a missed opportunity. Look, I think I think there's a couple of things there. One, how the hell did it suddenly become 7 billion? Yeah, there's construction costs and everything, but that's a big jump from 2.6. So that's kind of a side issue. And one of the reasons why I think it might have jumped out is because of the original good idea, in a sense of, it won't be the Melbourne Commonwealth Games, it'll be the Victorian one out in the regions and everything.
The whole state.
Problem is, Melbourne already has a lot of stadiums, has a lot of swimming pools.
They like sport in Melbourne.
Whereas as soon as you say, we're doing something in Bendigo, it's like, is there an Olympic swimming pool out in Bendigo? And so suddenly you are actually having to construct a lot of things, even if they are on a temporary basis, such as stands in Ballarat and things like that. But the costs are always going to rise, and with all the construction costs, as anyone who's tried to build a home recently knows, it's just gone massive because of the supply side issues that we were talking about. For me, the really good thing about the decision is that I think it might be the first time ever we've actually had economics used as a reason to cancel one of these big events, rather than, this is why we're hosting it, and also this is why it doesn't matter that costs are blown out, because it's going to create 12,000 jobs over 9 years.
Afterwards. Tourism.
There's going to be lots of tourism over 10 years. Where you read these reports, I wrote an article on it for this week, and I was having a look at some of the reports, and this is the other thing. When I was in the public service, I joined the public service in 2006, and the first thing I was actually working on was the Melbourne 2006 Commonwealth Games. I was part of the public service, Australian Public Service Task Force on the Commonwealth Games, which was lots of fun, but the fact that, it was only back in 2006, which in a lot of people's minds wasn't that about 5 years ago or something? Whereas in actual fact, about 5 years ago in 2018, we had another Commonwealth Games in the Gold Coast. So these aren't really, well, most people had forgot, though. That was the problem. But I was looking at a report done after the Commonwealth Games talking about the benefits. You think, okay, it was done after the Games, so it's going to be a bit more honest than these ones that are done 10 years before and say, it's going to be great. They were forecasting that it was going to bring in, they would have over 9 years, would have brought in $2.6 billion into the Queensland economy.
2.6 billion?
2.6 billion that's a lot, especially in over 10 years in an economy that is worth $350 billion in 1 year. So
less than 1%.
Less than 1%. But the really classic thing was that this report was written at the end of 2018. It was forecasting that 1.4 billion of that 2.5 billion was going to come through tourism and increase international conferences held on the Gold Coast in the 4 years from 2018 to 2022. And I'm reading this going, gee, I hope nothing happened that disrupted that prediction.
Did anything happen between 2018 and 2022
I blacked out for a couple of years.
Stopped conferences from occurring, stopped tourism?
So, most of these big events, the numbers that are justifying them are dodgy as all hell. There is no... And to be honest, I thought, my hope is that one of the things from this response is that the Victorian government is still going to actually build a lot of the facilities that they were planning to build. And it kind of highlights you don't need to have a Commonwealth Games or Olympic Games or anything like that to actually build these things. If you think a regional centre deserves an Olympic swimming pool or an aquatic centre because the people in that area and in regional areas will use it, then build the damn thing. Don't justify it because, this will create 52 jobs and bring in X number. No, if you think it's actually good for the society, you think the government can afford it, then make your pitch and say this is what we're going to do, and allow voters to go, yeah, that seems like a waste of money. But they might say it's a good thing if it's a swimming pool. If it's a shooting range, they might go, yeah, we've already got one a town over. We don't need another one. It's that type of thing where we've far too often seen these events justified as, oh, we'll improve the transport system because we're holding the Commonwealth Games or Olympic Games. It's like, why not just improve the transport system?
If it's good for society,
you don't need to wait. I mean, there's plenty of towns around. Like I grew up in Adelaide. We're an aquatic centre, a really good aquatic centre. We didn't have a Commonwealth Games. You don't need justifications for all these things, and there's far too many justifications of things on an economic basis that aren't actually all that economically viable, and things that are discounted because, oh no, there's a cost, we can't afford that right now. And it's like, well, you could use the same dodgy methods if you want to come up with something for an economic benefit. Believe me, it is doable. You just tweak the multipliers a little bit and estimate how many tourists or how many people are going to use something. We really, I think, and this is weird coming from an economist, but I think we really need to stop using economics to justify things rather than just, is this good for society? Would this make people better off? Would this make people happy? Would this give us better knowledge of the world? Whether it's a writers' festival or whether it's building a road that we think actually people deserve to have a good road to drive on rather than one full of potholes. You don't need to go, well, if we fill in all these potholes, that'll improve productivity by 0.3% and that equals $4 billion. No, fill the damn potholes in.
And that leads into our last one nicely, which is today, the government has released a wellbeing framework. So usually when we think about wellbeing in Australia, we don't even have to say economic wellbeing. We just think about wellbeing. We think economic growth, we think inflation, we think unemployment, we think economics basically. But a very narrow holy trinity, if you like, of economic statistics, and that determines how well the country as a whole is doing. And what the government's released today is a far larger, about 50 odd metrics of whether or not we're doing well. And the idea of that is to say, well, well-being is a very broad understanding, and if we only look at it really narrowly, then we'll only focus on those narrow parts and we won't look at the wider well-being. So what's in the latest well-being framework?
Oh, look, it goes from things such as health, education, sustainability, so it talks about climate change and the environment, safety. There is economics, but it's sort of divvied up into terms of things like prosperity, but also looking at measures dealing with people who are struggling, homelessness and various things like inequality. There's a bit of gender stuff there as well. It really, I mean, as I say, it's about 131 pages, stacks of data in there. That doesn't mean it's all perfect and all without criticism. You look at the measures it's using for emissions, it's still using a fairly dodgy measure of emissions that includes land use. There's also, one of the good things about this, hopefully, is that there are a number of measures which are really good, but aren't actually counted all that often. Sometimes they're only coming out every 4 years or even longer if they're linked to the census. And it's a hope that, given that this is supposedly, in a sense, a wellbeing budget, which means sort of an annual thing,
we'll see
hopefully from that they go, right, we actually need to count this a bit more regularly. We need to know, if these things are increasing or decreasing. Rather than just, we'll wait every 5 years and say whether it's
and the
going.
Environment's a great example of this, right? So, you could have an economy that's doing really, really well, that's polluting madly and causing long-term damage to the environment, and your narrow economic metrics might be doing really well, but actually the quality of life of all the people in the country is going down because the environment, the thing that's supporting them and sustaining them, is actually degrading quite rapidly.
Yeah, and this is, it's not a new idea.
We're not breaking new ground.
No, and when it was proposed by Jim Chalmers when Labor were in opposition, it was ridiculed as being some real left-wing fairies at the bottom.
It was all chanting.
Whereas the OECD have had a better life index for decades.
And
it would be interesting to see if the government is going to go a bit like the OECD, where they've actually produced the figures and in a sense got an index for all of these different categories. And they have a tool where you're actually able to go and go, well, actually, I value education a bit more than I do economic prosperity, or I value national or personal safety a bit more. And you can sort of, in a sense, design what you want to be, and it ranks countries according to, in a sense, what you value and what you think are things that make well-being. And I think in this way we could also sort of look at, okay, we can measure these things, but what does it mean if, for example, we're very economic prosperous, but our climate is terrible, or our health is struggling, you know? And so I think this is a great start, and I think we need now to think, okay, what are we going to do with these? We don't want it just to be, oh, here's the annual well-being report, and oh yes, it's improved. This measure is improved. This measure is stable. It's like, well, okay, but what's the overall sense?
What can we do to make these things better?
Yeah, and also this sense of, at the moment, it's just, oh, here are the initiatives we have done that are addressing these things, rather than that being part of the thing. We are bringing this because we want to increase sustainability, or we want to increase our performance on security, or something like that. Rather, it's, oh, we've got these things, we better come up with some examples of things that we've done, or what have we done in the past 12 months. So we'll say that was a national security measure, but it's really a bit of a after the fact kind of thing. And so I think this is a good framework, and it's then how they're going to shift it into actually it becoming kind of part of the budget process, becoming part of actual policy process and policy development.
And hopefully people holding them to account. Well, actually, it's just gone after 2:30, so we're going to have to end it there. Thank you very much for tuning in to another Nation in the Nutshell. We try and do this every fortnight, so fortnight from now on Friday, we will again go through. And I mean, on next week, we should see the new inflation figures. So there'll be lots more economic news coming out. And the RBA, I think, is making a decision over the next fortnight on interest rates.
And wages, I think, are coming out as well. Wages data.
So I'm sure there'll be lots of information. So please join us again next Friday. A fortnight Friday, for Nation in a Nutshell. And thanks for joining.